Hey guys, welcome back to another video. I want to speak to you today about Medballs and the use of Medballs in dynamic movement, the whole idea around dynamic posture and how you can use Medballs to improve the way that your posture is carried dynamically, how Medballs are seen currently in the industry, how they might be used, and really how you can go away and place Medballs from a static ballistic and then into a more of a dynamic nature within your program. So typically Medballs are used in just a typical throwing action throughout the industry. A lot of people are using them as a way to improve rate of force development, as a way to really just exert power through an external stimulus or implement. It really is pretty typical, and I enjoy using Medball throws with a few of my athletes, but it is a small portion of the way in which I would use a Medball in my training for dynamic and ballistic based movements. The reason being is we're obviously looking to try to move a light object at a higher velocity, and you quickly see the changes when you literally just add a couple of pounds or another kilo to the ball, and the ball might work its way up to being 5 kilos or around 10 to 12 pounds. And you straight away just see the velocity really diminish quite quickly. So I think there are other ways in which you can exert a lot of force at speed through an external stimulus. You could just use a lighter form of a throw, whether it's throwing a baseball, throwing a cricket ball. And really, Medballs, they weren't typically introduced to be used as a throwing implement. We just have an affinity for picking up a ball and wanting to launch it. And so that kind of relates back to the history of the medicine ball. We call them Medballs now, but they are known as a medicine ball. The medicine ball was created in the late 1800s, and they were used by physicians and doctors to improve posture and the way that we held ourselves, often used in older generations of people that were struggling with mobility, just general day-to-day strength and being able to carry themselves well. So a doctor would use a large medicine ball. They were old school, big, thick leather medicine balls, and they probably didn't exceed anything over 10 pounds, but a patient would hold the medicine ball out in front of them and use that as a way to leverage themselves out of a chair. They were also used in things like attenuated kind of movements, so that people would swing the ball back and forth, and straight away they're working a lot of co-contractions and ways in which they can stabilize better, because they may have lost that ability just from not training that as they've gotten into older ages. Now, my background actually comes from Eric and Eric's mentor, Zoltan Tenke. Zoltan was a Hungarian track and field coach that coached Eric in Canada. He actually would have got a lot of this work from the Russians taking this original medicine ball work and actually starting with more static-based sporting movements or training movements, kind of increasing that into more ballistic movements and then bringing that into fully dynamic-based movements. Really, that's how I want to look at how we can piece together some of these uses of the medicine ball to really implement it into your training. So if we're looking typically at dynamic posture really is us focusing on how we can challenge posture. Now, it often is the case that you'll develop an athlete that's quite strong, quite dynamic, but they may only be using just typical strength means. They may just be using simple jumping actions and sprinting based movements. And whilst that is a pretty solid program, I think there are kind of components in between that a lot of people miss out on. And the quality of how someone holds themselves and how they're able to stack the body effectively, organize the body effectively, and actually, if there is a moment in sport where something is slightly off to the side in front of them, something where the athlete has to slightly change the position of the center of mass, how they hold their posture and how things change due to the dynamic side of reacting in sport, then really we need to be prepared for that. And so the phrase is kind of like having a cannon fired out of a canoe. We have this instability. We don't have this postural integrity that we can hold effectively and actually use what we have to propel ourselves in the ways that we see fit in our sport. And so we can use basic movements to start out with. So a static based movement might be something as simple as a single leg RDL. the ball is swinging back into the free leg that's coming behind and it sits into the hip. And we might use that med ball then to thrust upwards as we swing the free leg through into a high knee position. And that ball might then actually go from the hip into an overhead position. Again, this is about changing the lever arm, where we're positioning ourselves in terms of how we're dealing with that ball moving away from our center of mass. So how do we co-contract in certain areas? How do we stabilize certain areas to be able to handle that? And I think these are really effective ways to actually get a little bit more sport specific there. So obviously in a static way, it is very low force. It is pretty slow. It's not going to be massively specific, but actually there might be some contractions there. There's some stabilizing methods that could be relatively specific. If we're to move that on then to more of a ballistic form of movement, you could be challenging the posture in something as simple as like a broad jump. You have the med ball placed out in front of you at, let's say, chest height. Let's say we're using a squat jump based broad jump action, and we're sat in the bottom of that movement and we have to initiate everything primarily from using our hips and our ankles and how they synchronize to actually propel us forward. What the med ball is really doing effectively here is taking away the contribution of the arms. So we're really isolating those hips and how those hips and ankles work together then. And what I find is really quite effective here as well, is we take that step from ballistic to dynamic, is actually how we interact with the med ball. So what's really effective here is how we grip the med ball. So let's say that we are holding a med ball out in front of us and we're doing a basic leaping action. What's happening as we come down to land, we're getting this contraction of actually, we grip the ball, that stabilizes the shoulder girdle to lock in a little bit as we stabilize, as we hit the ground. And then you're going to get a contralateral work from, let's say, the right shoulder to stabilizing the left hip and so on and so forth from the other side. And what we're getting is this really quick, dynamic stabilization of really the whole posture and all of the core that's going to interact in dynamic movement anyway. And really this is going to have a trickle-down effect into how the feet are stabilizing and contracting at the right time when you're interacting with the floor. So that is another way in which you can use med balls in dynamic movement. So if you're doing a plyometric, you can use it in a holding action. You can also then use it in, let's say, a deep tier form of movement where you're adding to the eccentric loading. So if you're using something like a skater bound with the med ball, if you're going from your left leg to your right leg, you'll swing the med ball from your left hip. As you come onto the right leg, it will be swung down into the right hip. And what you're doing there is you're adding a little bit of velocity. So it challenges that control of the chest as it drops down. I don't want to completely sink into it and completely lose my posture, because when I'm trying to get back out of that right leg, I've got to unravel that posture. I'm likely to spend more time on the ground. And actually, I'm challenging that with swinging that ball, increasing the speed, potentially increasing the eccentric landing forces. And ball attenuation is a great way to use a med ball. Again, even from the static all the way through to the dynamic forms of movement, your med ball should not exceed anywhere from 2 to 4 kg. And that would be, let's say, I'd say around 8 or 9 pounds to 12 pounds. You really don't want it to exceed that, because the things that will diminish quite quickly are the quality of ground contacts and the quality of the output. Ground contact time is the first thing to go when it comes to dynamic movements. So just pay attention to that. If things are really starting to slow down in a pretty basic form of movement, then you're not working the qualities that you want to. Have a think about where you would also place them, because it is potentially an increasing in overload on the deep tier movements. The overload might not be increased with more faster dynamic movements because you're potentially increasing the ground contact time. So that may mean that the spike in terms of the tendon forces is potentially going to drop. So have a think about where you would place it. I would probably place the med ball stuff. It would be typical to just sit with any deep tier form of movement. But the dynamic stuff, it might be that you do a few, let's say, light tier movements with the med ball, and then I would take that med ball away and actually work a real faster dynamic action after that. And I think it's a nice way to contrast the use of the med ball and then taking that med ball away. So I think those are some typical things that I would concentrate on when it comes to using med balls in dynamic movement. I think they're a fantastic tool. I often find that if you're having an athlete that struggles maybe to keep their hips high in a certain movement, if they're really sat down and they can't control maybe how their chest is staying taller in, let's say, a deceleration, maybe they're completely losing their posture. You add these sorts of positions in where the ball's held out in front or overhead, you quickly learn how to, number one, control the posture, and number two, it actually starts to obviously build more of a capacity to handle more force. And it could be going back to that first point in that you might not just be able to know how to control it, and it just needs a little bit of learning to go with that. So if you enjoyed it, let me know below in the comments, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Enjoy using your med balls.